History is often a tapestry woven by the victors, a grand narrative carefully constructed to highlight the glory of empires while silencing the desperate cries of the oppressed. Yet, if you listen closely to the crashing waves of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, the water holds secrets that ink and paper have long tried to drown. There are stories not of subservience but of absolute defiance. Imagine an era where the mighty British Empire, an unstoppable force hungry for global domination through the East India Company, found itself completely paralyzed. They were not brought to their knees by a rival European kingdom, but by the very people they had reduced to property. These were the Black Corsairs, men and women who shattered their iron chains, took control of the open seas, and captured the crown's most prized warships. They did not just demand freedom, they demanded humiliation. They forced an empire built on exploitation to empty its coffers and pay ransom in pure gold. If you find value in these untold stories, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below to keep this forgotten. History Alive. The journey begins. The ocean has always been a realm of profound duality. For millions stolen from the warm, breathing earth of Africa, the sea was an abyss, a boundless expanse of salt and sorrow that carried them away from their ancestry and into the dark. More of the transatlantic slave trade. The wooden bellies of the galleons were floating coffins where humanity was stripped away, replaced by the cold, calculating mathematics of commerce. Yet, in a twist of poetic justice that history rarely affords, this very same ocean became the crucible of their liberation. The transition from a captive shivering in the suffocating darkness of a ship's hold to a master of the roaring waves is not merely a change of circumstance. It is a profound spiritual resurrection. It requires a mind willing to look at the violent, unforgiving sea and recognize it, not as a prison, but as a vast, unclaimed sanctuary. To understand the Black Corsairs, one must first understand the profound psychological transformation born from total loss. When everything has been taken from a human being, their home, their name, their family, their very right to exist as a free soul, a peculiar kind of fearlessness takes root. There is nothing left to lose but the chains themselves. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, as the East India Company spread its mercantile tentacles across the globe, the seas were heavily trafficked by massive merchant vessels, heavily armed and brimming with stolen wealth. Aboard these floating fortresses, enslaved African men were often forced to labor as sailors. They were made to climb the dizzying heights of the rigging, to navigate the treacherous currents, and to fire the heavy cannons that protected their captors' gold. In doing so, the empire unwittingly taught its captives the very arts of naval warfare required to dismantle it. The exact moment of the first mutiny is lost to the salt and the wind, but its echo resonates through time. It usually began in the quiet, desperate hours of the night, a whispered conversation in the damp quarters, a shared glance between men whose backs bore the same scars, a silent pact forged in the realization that they outnumbered their masters. The uprising was never simply about survival. It was an explosive reclamation of dignity. When the swords clashed and the blood stained the wooden decks, it was the sound of destiny shifting. Taking control of a ship was an act of profound rebellion. Suddenly, the vessel that was designed to be their tomb became an instrument of their vengeance. These liberated men did not sail back to the shores of an Africa they had lost, for they knew the ports were crawling with slave catchers and colonial armadas. Instead, they chose the horizon. They embraced the life of Corsairs, navigating the geopolitical gray areas of a world at war with itself. What made these black mariners exceptionally dangerous to the British Crown was not just their skill in combat, but their profound understanding of the enemy's mind. They knew the trade routes. They knew the blind spots of the Royal Navy. They intimately understood the unyielding greed of the East India Company, a corporate leviathan that valued cargo above human life on the open water. These men established a floating society completely antithetical to the empires of Europe. On a Corsair ship commanded by black captains, the rigid hierarchies of race and class dissolved into the ocean breeze. Here, a man was judged not by his birth or the color of his skin, but by his courage during a storm, his fairness in dividing the spoils, and his loyalty to the crew. It was an early, radical experiment in democracy. Floating on the waves of a world dominated by absolute monarchs and wealthy oligarchs, every decision, from the election of a captain to the division of rations, was voted upon. They had created a republic of outcasts. This newfound freedom, however, was accompanied by a relentless, burning desire to strike back at the architects of their suffering. They were not common thieves stealing for mere survival. They were political insurgents aiming at the very heart of the global economy. To strike a British warship was to strike at the arrogance of the crown. They spent months studying the movement of the East India Company fleets, observing the arrogant complacency of British captains who believed their immense galleons were untouchable. The Black Corsairs knew that an empire built on the illusion of invincibility is most vulnerable when that illusion is shattered. They prepared in the shadows of hidden coves and uncharted islands, repairing captured cannons, stockpiling gunpowder, and honing their discipline. They were preparing to do the impossible, to hunt the hunter, to turn the predator into the prey, and to make the architects of the slave trade pay a price so steep it would forever alter the balance of power on the high seas. The storm was gathering, and the empire, blinded by its own hubris, had no idea that the winds of retribution were already at its back. The establishment of a new society upon the restless waves was a phenomenon that defied the rigid imaginations of European monarchs. To the aristocratic lords in London, a ship was merely a wooden instrument of commerce and war, governed by the whip and the terrifying absolute authority of a captain who served as a proxy for the king. But to the black Corsairs, the captured galleon was something entirely unprecedented in their lives. It was sovereign territory. It was a floating nation where the chains of land-based hierarchies could not anchor. As the coastline faded into a thin, hazy line on the horizon, so too did the oppressive laws of the plantations and the colonial courts. Out here, surrounded by the infinite expanse of blue, they were no longer defined as cargo, nor as fugitives, but as architects of their own destiny. They engaged in a radical experiment of self-governance that predated the democratic revolutions of Europe and America by decades. They forged a republic out of mahogany and canvas. The men gathered on the blood-stained decks not to crown a new tyrant, but to draft a covenant of equals. Every man, regardless of whether he was born a prince in the Kingdom of Congo or raised in the brutal sugar fields of Jamaica, was granted a voice. They elected their captains through the raising of hands, choosing leaders based strictly on maritime skill, strategic brilliance, and personal bravery. Furthermore, they understood the corrupting nature of absolute power, a lesson etched into their flesh by the overseers. Thus, they stripped the captain of his absolute authority outside of combat. They elected a quartermaster to distribute rations fairly, to resolve disputes, and to ensure that the captain himself adhered to the laws they had collectively written. The wealth they sought from the heavily laden vessels of the East India Company was not meant to enrich a distant crown, but to be divided equitably among the crew. For men who had been robbed of the fruits of their own labor for generations, the concept of a guaranteed, equal share of the spoils was profoundly revolutionary. It restored their humanity. It turned an act of piracy into an act of profound socio-economic rebellion. The ship became a sanctuary for the dispossessed, a beacon of terrifying freedom that sailed in direct defiance of a world that demanded their subjugation. They were not merely surviving the ocean. They were utilizing its boundless nature to breathe life into a utopian vision that the land had violently rejected. This floating republic, however, could not sustain itself in isolation. A single ship, no matter how fiercely commanded, was a fragile speck against the colossal, industrialized might of the British Royal Navy and the East India Company's heavily armed merchant fleets. To wage a war of humiliation against the most powerful empire on earth, the Black Corsairs needed to cultivate a force born from the very shadows of the transatlantic diaspora. The network they built was invisible to the arrogant eyes of the colonizers. It existed in the whispered conversations in the bustling, disease-ridden ports of the Caribbean, in the clandestine meetings behind the warehouses of the Gold Coast, and in the rhythmic, coded songs sung by dock workers loading sugar and tobacco. The diaspora, scattered and broken by the mechanics of slavery, found a way to stitch itself back together through the maritime underground. Escaped slaves, indigenous mariners, and disenfranchised European sailors, who had grown disgusted by the cruelty of the merchant marines, flocked to the black flag. The Corsair captains understood that their greatest weapon was not the iron of their cannons, but the collective trauma and burning intelligence of their crew. They absorbed men from distinct, diverse cultures who spoke a multitude of tongues but shared a singular, unifying language of defiance. They learned to synchronize their movements, blending traditional African martial disciplines with advanced European naval tactics. The intelligence network they established was devastatingly effective. Enslaved servants working in the mansions of colonial governors would eavesdrop on the shipping schedules of the East India Company, passing the information to freedmen in the markets, who would then smuggle the coordinates to the Corsair vessels waiting beyond the horizon. The colonizers believed their subjects were simple, docile property, entirely oblivious to the vast, sophisticated web of espionage tightening around their lucrative trade routes. The Black Corsairs weaponized the empire's own prejudice against it. By the time a British captain realized the depth of the coordination behind a seemingly random pirate attack, the rigging was already burning and the gold was already gone. They had transformed the tragic, scattered fragments of their people into a unified, lethal instrument of retribution, proving that while empires could chain the body, they could never conquer the furious, calculating spirit of a people determined to reclaim their stolen world. To comprehend the magnitude of the Corsairs' defiance, one must look into the cold, calculating eyes of the adversary they chose to hunt. The British East India Company was not merely a trading enterprise, it was a sovereign power cloaked in the guise of commerce, a leviathan of greed that swallowed continents and regurgitated them as profit. It was an entity that possessed its own sprawling armies, its own fortified territories, and a fleet of massive merchant warships known as East Indiamen, which rivaled the navies of entire European nations. To the directors sitting in their opulent London boardrooms, The world was nothing more than a vast ledger of assets and liabilities. The spices of India, the silks of China, and the human souls torn from the shores of Africa were all reduced to mere commodities, weighed and measured strictly for their capacity to generate gold. This was a new, terrifying breed of empire. One driven not solely by the divine right of kings, but by the insatiable, mechanical hunger of early global capitalism. The company operated with an arrogant assumption of absolute invulnerability. Its massive galleons, heavily timbered and bristling with rows of iron cannons, sailed the oceans with a profound sense of entitlement, projecting the terrifying majesty of the British crown. The men who commanded these floating fortresses were aristocrats of the sea, blinded by their own hubris. They believed that the people they oppressed, the enslaved, the colonized, the impoverished were biologically and intellectually incapable of mounting any sophisticated resistance against the civilized might of the empire. They viewed the ocean as their exclusive dominion, a highway of wealth paved over the bones of the millions who had perished in the Middle Passage. But this monolithic arrogance bred a fatal complacency. The empire was so entirely consumed by the mechanics of extraction and the counting of its gold that it failed to notice the shadows lengthening along its own decks. The East India Company had built a machine of unprecedented global power, but in its absolute disregard for human life, it had unwittingly manufactured the very instruments of its own destruction. The Black Corsairs understood the nature of this leviathan intimately, having been crushed beneath its weight. They knew that a beast, driven entirely by greed, possesses no loyalty, no true courage, and a desperate vulnerability to the loss of its wealth. They were not intimidated by the sheer size of the company's galleons, for they had built them, loaded them, and bled upon their planks. Yet, the very arrogance that fueled this mercantile beast became the architecture of its undoing. The company directors believed their monopoly was protected by the sheer terror of their cannons, completely oblivious to the fact that the most potent weapon on the high seas was information. To hunt the colossal East Indiaman, the Black Corsairs did not rely on blind luck or chaotic piracy. They relied on the whispers carried upon the trade winds. They had cultivated a vast, clandestine intelligence network that operated right under the noses of the colonial elite. This network was fueled by the invisible people of the empire. When a British captain sat at a polished mahogany table in Jamaica or Barbados, loudly boasting of his cargo of gold and his impending departure schedule, he did not see the enslaved African pouring his wine. He saw only a piece of property, an object devoid of intellect or comprehension. But that silent figure was listening. Every detail, the number of cannons, the size of the crew, the exact coordinates of the planned route, and the designated rendezvous points was carefully committed to memory. This vital intelligence would then begin a miraculous, invisible journey. It would be whispered in the suffocating heat of the plantation kitchens, passed to the dock workers who loaded the sugar barrels, and finally transmitted to the free black mariners and smugglers who navigated the treacherous coastal waters. They communicated through coded songs whose rhythms mimicked the shifting of the tides, through subtle markings carved into the wooden pilings of the wharves, and through a shared, silent language of resistance that the colonizers were entirely deaf to. By the time a heavily armed British galleon raised its anchors and set sail for the open ocean, the Black Corsairs already knew its destination. They knew its blind spots, its speed, and the exact moment when its crew would be most vulnerable. The empire had freely surrounded itself with a vast army of spies, rendered invisible solely by the colonizers' own profound racial prejudice. This network of whispers transformed the scattered, traumatized fragments of the diaspora into a highly synchronized, lethal force. The Corsairs were no longer merely reacting to the brutality of the world. They were actively reading its currents, anticipating its movements, and positioning themselves to strike at the very heart of the empire's wealth. The trade winds, which had once carried the ships of their enslavement, were now carrying the blueprints of their vengeance, proving that true power lies not in the thunder of cannons, but in the unbreakable solidarity of the oppressed. To gaze upon a British East Indiaman in its full glory was to look upon the very architecture of global domination. These vessels were not mere ships. They were floating castles of oak and iron, masterpieces of European maritime engineering designed to project the terrifying authority of the crown across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. Towering masts scraped the heavens, holding acres of heavy canvas that caught the trade winds and propelled thousands of tons of timber, stolen wealth, and heavy artillery through the water. Along their towering flanks ran rows of square gunports behind which lurked massive iron cannons, capable of unleashing a storm of fire and lead that could splinter a lesser vessel into driftwood in a matter of minutes. To the aristocratic officers who paced the immaculate, sun-bleached quarterdecks, the ship was a testament to their inherent superiority. They resided in opulent cabins adorned with fine mahogany, velvet drapery, and crystal decanters, completely insulated from the groaning, weeping bowels of the very machine they commanded. Below the waterline, the reality of the galleon was a claustrophobic nightmare of disease, darkness, and cruelty, a space where human beings had been packed like ballast, gasping for air in the suffocating heat. The colonizers believed that the sheer imposing silhouette of these maritime leviathans was enough to paralyze any lesser soul with fear. They trusted in the thickness of their hulls and the deafening roar of their broadsides to maintain the fragile illusion of their invincibility. But the black Corsairs did not look at the galleon with the wide-eyed terror of the uninitiated. They looked at it with the cold, analytical intimacy of survivors who had been forced to study the anatomy of the beast from the inside out. They had swung from the dizzying height of its rigging with bleeding hands. They had scrubbed its decks beneath the shadow of the whip. They knew the exact weight of its cannons, the time it took to swab and reload the barrels, and the agonizing slowness with which the massive, heavily laden ship responded to the helm. To the Corsairs, the British galleon was not a terrifying sea monster. It was a clumsy, bloated giant, blinded by its own immense size. They understood its vulnerabilities better than the admirals who commissioned it. They knew the blind spots beneath the curve of the bow and the stern, where the heavy guns could not depress low enough to fire. They recognized that a fortress designed to obliterate navies in a formal, linear battle line was desperately ill-equipped to handle the chaotic, swarming agility of men who fought not for the glory of a king, but for the fundamental right to exist. The knowledge of the oppressor's machine had been etched into the minds of the oppressed, transforming their profound suffering into a devastating tactical advantage. The collision of these two vastly different worlds was not heralded by the formal declarations of war favored by European diplomats, but by the eerie quiet stillness of a tropical dawn. The ocean was draped in a thick, silver mist that blurred the line between water and sky, a heavy curtain hiding the impending reckoning. Aboard the East Indiaman, the morning watch was a routine of arrogant complacency. The British sailors, weary from the long voyage and lulled into a false sense of security by the sheer size of their vessel, moved sluggishly across the dew-dampened decks. The officers slept soundly in their fine linens, dreaming of the fortunes they would reap upon reaching the markets of London, entirely unaware that the ocean around them had ceased to be their domain. Out of the dissipating fog, the shapes began to materialize. They were not the grand, lumbering warships of a rival European power, but a pack of sleek, violently fast Corsair vessels, stripped of all unnecessary weight and built for pure, terrifying speed. The black Corsairs did not approach with the thunderous roar of a broadside attack, which would have given the giant galleon time to awaken and unleash its deadly iron teeth. Instead, they glided across the glassy surface of the water like ghosts, cutting through the waves with an agonizing silence that belonged only to men who had spent their lives learning to breathe without making a sound. The tactical brilliance of the assault lay in its absolute precision. They navigated their swift crafts directly into the blind spots of the galleon, perfectly positioning themselves beneath the lethal arc of the enemy's cannons. Before the British officers could rush to the deck and scream orders to load the guns, the air was suddenly filled with a sharp, whistling sound of iron grappling hooks biting deep into the mahogany rails of the East India. The ropes were pulled taut, physically binding the swift, desperate vessels of the liberated to the colossal fortress of the Empire. In that singular, violent union of wood and rope, the hierarchy of the colonial world was instantly shattered. The agonizing silence of the approach erupted into a deafening roar as hundreds of black mariners, armed with cutlasses, boarding axes, and the burning memory of their chains, surged upward over the gunwales like a relentless dark tide. They did not fight with the rigid, mechanical discipline of conscripted sailors. They fought with the fluid, explosive energy of a long-suppressed storm finally making landfall. The ambush at dawn was not merely a naval skirmish. It was the terrifying manifestation of a historical debt coming due, a moment when the architects of human misery were forced to look into the eyes of the very people they had tried to erase, only to find that the fire of their humanity had never been extinguished. The physical clash upon the polished wooden decks of the East Indiaman was brief, brutal, and profoundly disorienting for the architects of the Empire. For generations, the officers of the Royal Navy and the merchant fleets had been conditioned to believe that warfare was a gentleman's game, a structured exchange of broadsides governed by the civilized rules of European engagement. They expected their adversaries to fight for a flag, for a monarch, or for a negotiated treaty. They were entirely unprepared for the sheer, elemental force of men who fought for the reclamation of their own stolen humanity. As the black Corsairs swarmed over the rails, moving with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity born of shared suffering and absolute resolve, the illusion of British invincibility shattered like fragile glass against an anvil. The defenders, clad in their immaculate uniforms and armed with the finest steel of the realm, found themselves paralyzed not just by the sudden violence but by an existential shock. They were looking into the faces of the very people they had classified as subhuman property, yet they saw no docile submission, only the cold, calculating intelligence of master tacticians executing a flawless assault. The Corsairs moved swiftly to neutralize the ship's commanding officers, dismantling the rigid hierarchy of the galleon from the top down. The crack of flintlock pistols and the clash of cutlasses echoed beneath the towering masts. But the true victory was not won through sheer bloodshed. It was won through the psychological collapse of the oppressor, when the British captain, a man whose word had once been absolute law, found himself disarmed and surrounded by mariners who bore the faded scars of the overseer's whip on their backs. He realized that his entire worldview was a gilded lie. He had believed his ship was an impregnable fortress of civilization, yet it had been effortlessly dismantled by the very outcasts his civilization had sought to crush. The ultimate symbol of this collapse was the striking of the colors. High above the chaos, the flag of the East India Company, a banner that represented a global monopoly built on the bones of millions, a symbol of unyielding corporate greed and imperial arrogance, fluttered in the morning breeze. When a black corsair climbed the rigging, his hands gripping the ropes with the strength of a free man, and severed the halyard, the heavy cloth plummeted to the deck like a dying bird. In that singular, breathtaking moment, the vast, terrifying machinery of the British Empire was rendered completely impotent. The falling of the flag was not just the surrender of a single ship. It was a profound, symbolic tearing of the historical narrative. The ocean, which had silently witnessed centuries of unpunished atrocities, now bore witness to a moment of perfect, symmetrical justice. The Leviathan had been brought to its knees by the hands of those it had tried to swallow, and as the flag was trampled under the bare feet of the liberated, a new, terrifying reality dawned upon the high seas, that the transition of power upon the captured galleon was marked by an irony so profound that it seemed scripted by the hand of a vengeful deity. The grandest cabins of the East Indiaman, once sanctuaries of opulent luxury where the aristocratic elite had sipped fine port and casually calculated the value of human cargo, were swiftly repurposed by the Corsair command. But the true masterpiece of this historical reversal lay deep within the belly of the ship. The British lords, the wealthy merchants, and the high-ranking officers, men whose soft hands had never known the callousness of labor and whose lungs had only breathed the perfumed air of privilege, were systematically marched down the narrow, creaking ladders into the dark, suffocating hold. This was the exact subterranean space originally designed to transport enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage. It was a cavern of weeping wood, permanently stained with the scent of fear, disease, and despair. As the heavy iron grates slammed shut above them, plunging the lords of the empire into the claustrophobic gloom, the sheer weight of their terrifying new reality descended upon them. They were not beaten with the mindless savagery that their own overseers employed. They were simply placed into the physical reality of the system they had built and profited from. The Black Corsairs, possessing a profound, chilling discipline, understood that physical torture was a crude weapon compared to the psychological devastation of forcing a tyrant to experience the exact mechanics of his own tyranny. In the damp, terrifying darkness, stripped of their velvet coats, their grand titles, and the absolute certainty of their racial superiority, the elite passengers found themselves reduced to a state of absolute, agonizing vulnerability. They sat in the very same filth, breathing the very same stagnant air, and listening to the very same groans of the wooden hull that countless captive souls had endured before them. The sensory deprivation of the hold worked like a brutal mirror, forcing them to look upon the monstrous nature of their own civilization. The men who now paced the decks above them, navigating the colossal ship with expert precision, were no longer abstract commodities listed on a bill of sale. They were the absolute arbiters of life and death. The Corsairs did not gloat in the darkness. Their silence was a far heavier punishment. It was the silence of men who had reclaimed their stolen power, and were now calmly assessing the ransom value of their former masters. The lords in the hold, shivering in the cold, unyielding reality of their captivity, finally understood that the empire they served was not invincible, and that the ocean, which they had claimed as their own private highway of wealth, had a memory far deeper and far more unforgiving than they could have ever imagined. The drafting of the ultimatum was a quiet, deliberate act performed by men who understood the profound weight of the written word. For centuries, the empires of Europe had used ink and parchment to divide the globe, to legitimize the theft of continents, and to legally define human beings as movable cargo. Now, the Black Corsairs were weaponizing that very same medium. Sitting in the ornate captain's cabin of the captured East Indiaman, a council of liberated mariners dictated their terms. They did not write with the desperate, pleading tone of fugitives. They wrote with the cold, unyielding authority of a sovereign power holding the absolute advantage. The letter was not merely a demand for gold. It was a philosophical indictment of the British Empire. It detailed the exact value of the ship, its cannons, its cargo of spices and silks, and the aristocratic lives shivering in the dark hold below. But it also placed a price on the arrogance of the crown. They demanded a ransom so astronomically high that it would force the East India Company to bleed its own to publicly acknowledge the power of the men it had enslaved. To deliver this unprecedented document, they did not send one of their own into the hangman's noose of a colonial port. Instead, they selected a low-ranking British sailor from the captured crew, a man who had been brutalized by his own officers. They gave him a small boat, enough provisions to reach a neutral harbor, and a heavy wax-sealed letter that carried the destiny of the empire's elite. As the small boat disappeared over the horizon, carrying the explosive truth toward the heart of the civilized world, the Corsairs turned their colossal prize toward the hidden sanctuaries of the deep ocean, disappearing into the vast, protective embrace of the waters they now commanded. The ocean, which had once been the silent accomplice to their enslavement, had now become the impenetrable fortress of their newfound republic. When the sealed letter finally reached the sprawling, rain-slicked streets of London, it carried a seismic shockwave that shattered the insulated reality of the British elite. The boardroom of the East India Company, a sanctuary of polished oak and quiet, calculating greed, was suddenly gripped by an existential terror. The wealthy directors, men who moved armies and fleets with a casual stroke of a quill, stared at the parchment as if it were a venomous serpent. It was entirely inconceivable to their prejudiced minds. A flagship of their invincible fleet, a floating fortress armed to the teeth, had not been sunk by a storm or captured by the Spanish Armada, but systematically dismantled and hijacked by a coordinated force of black mariners. The panic that swept through the financial heart of the empire was immediate and visceral. It was not just the staggering financial loss of the galleon and its cargo. It was the terrifying realization that the foundational myth of their global dominance had been violently exposed as a fragile lie. If the very people they enslaved could master the complex machinery of naval warfare, organize a clandestine intelligence network, and hold the sons of the aristocracy hostage for ransom, then no ship in the British merchant marine was truly safe. The stock of the East India Company trembled on the exchange. Whispers of the disaster leaked from the closed boardrooms into the coffeehouses and the halls of Parliament, twisting the pride of the empire into a profound, suffocating humiliation. The king's ministers were forced to confront an impossible dilemma. To pay the astronomical ransom was to legitimize a floating republic of freed slaves, and to publicly bow to men the law deemed as property, setting a dangerous, irreversible precedent that could ignite rebellions across every colony in the Caribbean and the Americas. Yet to refuse the demand was to condemn their own aristocratic kin to the dark, disease-ridden bowels of the very ship they had commissioned, and to lose a fortune in gold and weaponry. The empire found itself trapped in a brilliantly constructed snare, paralyzed by its own greed and suffocating under the weight of a historical reckoning it could no longer ignore. The capitulation of an empire is rarely a sudden collapse. Rather, it is a slow, agonizing bleed of pride, forced upon those who have never known the taste of surrender. In the shadowy corridors of power in London, the unimaginable was finally rationalized, not as a defeat, but as a grim necessity of commerce. The directors of the East India Company, men who weighed human souls against ledgers of profit, calculated that the loss of the aristocratic hostages and the heavily armed galleon would cause a catastrophic plunge in their global credibility. Thus, the order was given, signed with trembling hands and sealed with the crest of a humiliated crown. The ransom, a staggering fortune in pure gold, was quietly loaded onto a neutral vessel under the cover of a moonless night, far from the prying eyes of the public and the fierce pride of the Royal Navy. The rendezvous took place in the vast, unclaimed expanse of the open Atlantic, a meeting not of equals, but of worlds in profound collision. When the heavy, iron-bound chests were transferred to the deck of the captured East Indiaman, the clinking of the gold coins echoed with a deafening historical irony. This was the very wealth that had been violently extracted from the earth by the bleeding hands of the enslaved, stolen from the treasuries of conquered nations, and hoarded in the vaults of the oppressor. Now, it was being surrendered to the very people who had been the foundation of that brutal economic engine. The Black Corsairs did not cheer with the vulgar triumph of common pirates. They received the tribute with a cold, terrifying solemnity. They forced the British emissaries to open every chest, allowing the blinding reflection of the sun on the gold to illuminate the faces of the liberated. It was a transaction of absolute power, a moment where the mathematical logic of the empire was turned back upon itself, proving that the chains of bondage could indeed be melted down and recast as the currency of freedom. The captive lords were marched from the suffocating darkness of the hold, their faces pale, their aristocratic arrogance completely extinguished by the terror of their ordeal. They were traded for the gold, lowered into the small boats of the emissary, forever changed by the profound realization that their civilization was a fragile construct, easily dismantled by the sheer will of the oppressed. As the emissaries rowed desperately away from the colossal silhouette of the captured galleon, the Black Corsairs stood upon the deck, wealthy beyond imagination, holding the physical weight of the empire's apology in their scarred hands. With the staggering wealth of the oppressor safely secured in the hull of their floating fortress, the Black Corsairs turned their gaze away from the established shipping lanes and toward the uncharted peripheries of the colonial world. They understood with profound clarity that to remain on the open ocean was to invite the wrath of the entire British Royal Navy, a leviathan that would inevitably awaken from its shock and seek merciless retribution. They needed a sanctuary, a place where the gold could be transformed from mere currency into the foundation of a new reality. They navigated the captured East Indiamen through treacherous, hidden reefs and suffocating coastal fogs, guided by indigenous mariners and escaped slaves who knew the secret arteries of the earth. They dropped anchor in a hidden, secluded cove, a pristine crescent of land untouched by the devastating footprint of European plantations. Here, beneath the towering canopy of ancient trees and the watchful gaze of rugged mountains, they began to unload their impossible prize. The division of the gold was a sacred ceremony, a radical manifestation of the floating republic they had built upon the waves. There were no kings to claim the lion's share, no wealthy investors to siphon the profit. Every man, from the brilliant tactical commanders to the youngest cabin boy who had braved the terror of the boarding assault, received an exactly equal portion of the empire's wealth. But their vision extended far beyond mere individual enrichment. They pooled a vast portion of the gold to build a fleeting utopia upon the shore. They constructed homes not of wattle and mud, but of sturdy timber, fortifying their settlement with the heavy iron cannons stripped from the captured galleon. They established farmlands, planted crops, and forged a community entirely devoid of the lash and the auction block. It was a society where the trauma of the diaspora was slowly healed by the daily practice of absolute, uncompromised liberty. The children born in this hidden enclave opened their eyes to a world where they were not defined as property, but as the heirs to a terrifying and beautiful legacy of defiance. Yet, beneath the tranquil surface of this idyllic existence, a profound, agonizing awareness lingered in the minds of the Corsair leaders. They knew that their utopia was an aberration in a world entirely consumed by the mechanics of empire. They knew that the British crown, stung by the deepest humiliation in its naval history, would not rest until the architects of this rebellion were hunted down and erased from the ledger of history. The gold had bought them a precious, breathtaking moment of peace, but they remained acutely aware that the horizon.com, and beautiful as it appeared, was inevitably concealing the gathering storm of an empire preparing to strike back. The illusion of permanence is the most comforting and dangerous narcotic a liberated soul can consume. For the men and women who had built their sanctuary upon the hidden shores, the rhythm of the tides and the rustling of the unburdened canopy offered a profound, yet fragile peace. But across the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic, the wounded leviathan of the British Empire was neither sleeping nor forgiving. The sheer, unprecedented audacity of the Black Corsairs, the capturing of an East India, the humiliation of the aristocratic elite, and the extortion of a king's ransom in gold was an ideological contagion that the crown could not allow to spread. If the millions of enslaved individuals laboring under the suffocating brutality of the colonial machine learned that a galleon could be hijacked and a fortified utopia could be purchased with the oppressor's own coin, the entire economic foundation of the global empire would instantaneously collapse. Therefore, the response orchestrated within the cold marble halls of the Admiralty in London was not merely a mission of retrieval, it was a mandate of absolute, terrifying erasure. The Royal Navy, a mechanized armada of unprecedented destructive capability, was unleashed with a singular, vindictive purpose. They did not send merchant vessels or privateers. They sent ships of the line, colossal floating fortresses bristling with hundreds of heavy iron cannons, commanded by ruthless officers who viewed the annihilation of the Corsairs as a sacred defense of the natural order. The hunt was methodical, relentless, and driven by a bruised imperial pride that bordered on madness. They interrogated smugglers, tortured indigenous fishermen, and burned neutral ports to the ground, slowly tightening a massive, suffocating net around the Caribbean and the hidden peripheries of the Atlantic. The Corsairs, with their vast network of informants, felt the tremors of this approaching doom long before the white sails crested the horizon. The whispers on the trade winds, once carriers of opportunity, now brought only the chilling geometry of the approaching armadas. Yet, the liberated mariners did not succumb to the frantic panic of the condemned. They had tasted the absolute purity of freedom. They had looked the architects of their suffering in the eye and forced them to bow. They knew that their physical sanctuary was temporary, but the psychological sovereignty they had achieved was eternal. When the towering masts of the British warships finally materialized through the morning mist, eclipsing the sun and casting long, ominous shadows over the hidden cove, the Corsairs did not attempt to flee into the impenetrable jungle. They stood upon the battlements they had built with their own hands, manning the heavy cannons they had stripped from the very empire that now sought to destroy them. They prepared for a final, apocalyptic confrontation, not with the desperate hope of military victory, but with the profound, tragic resolve of martyrs. They fought to ensure that their final stand would cost the empire so dearly in blood and timber that the memory of their defiance would forever haunt the ledges of the Admiralty. The clash that ensued was not a battle. It was an execution of imperial fury upon the altar of human defiance. The thunder of the British broadsides tore through the tranquil beauty of the hidden cove, splintering the sturdy mahogany homes and churning the pristine white sands into a chaotic canvas of fire and ash. The Corsairs fought with the terrifying, beautiful ferocity of men and women who had already conquered death the moment they broke their chains. They unleashed a devastating barrage from their fortified positions, sinking smaller British vessels and severely crippling the vanguard of the Armada, proving one final time that the intellect and courage of the oppressed could match the mechanized might of the colonizer. Yet, the sheer, inexhaustible mathematics of the empire eventually overwhelmed the solitary spark of the utopia. The sanctuary fell, consumed by the relentless inferno of colonial vengeance. The survivors were scattered to the winds, fading back into the deep, protective anonymity of the maritime underground, while the fallen were embraced by the same soil they had briefly, miraculously, called their own. In the aftermath of the destruction, the British Empire engaged in its most insidious and enduring campaign, the campaign of historical erasure. The meticulous records of the East India Company were altered or locked away in impenetrable vaults. The aristocratic lords who had shivered in the dark hold of the galleons swore oaths of silence, taking the agonizing memory of their humiliation to their graves. The official narrative was sanitized, reducing the brilliantly orchestrated naval campaign of the Black Corsairs to mere footnotes of chaotic, nameless piracy. The empire could rebuild its ships and replenish its gold, but it could never publicly admit that it had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and extorted by the very people it classified as subhuman. What history is not solely authored by the ink of the victors. It is also preserved in the vast, unyielding memory of the elements. The ocean, which had served as the silent witness to the trauma of the Middle Passage and the glorious, fleeting triumph of the floating republic, refused to keep the empire's secrets. The legacy of the Black Corsairs transcended the physical destruction of their utopia. It became a phantom that haunted the colonial imagination, a whispered legend that circulated through the holds of slave ships, the suffocating heat of the sugar plantations, and the hidden harbors of the Caribbean. It was a story that reminded every enslaved soul that the chains were not unbreakable, that the colossal warships of the oppressor had blind spots, and that the sheer, unyielding will of a united people could bring the most powerful empire in the world to its knees. Even today, if you stand upon the shores of the Atlantic and listen closely to the rhythmic crashing of the waves, you are not merely hearing the movement of water, you are hearing the eternal, echoing roar of those who dared to capture the wind, those who forced the crown to pay its ransom in gold, and those who proved, once and for all, that freedom is not a gift granted by the powerful, but a right violently and beautifully reclaimed from the tide.